it's just a community made up of people, and they do come together, and I think that's important.
Welcome to Rooptown Stories.
For our first full-length conversation, we sat down with Susan Couso at the Lassen Historical Museum on North Weatherlow.
Listen in as she shares her knowledge of our town's history and of the surrounding area, and trees that smell like pineapple. Please introduce yourself.
My name is Susan Couso. I'm 74 years old. I came to Susanville in 1962 and graduated from Lassen High School in 1967.
Wow.
Got married in 1967. Still married.
That would make how many years?
55.
Wow.
Congratulations.
I've almost got him trained. I'm still working.
We're at almost 8 years, so
Yeah.
it's pretty good, I guess.
It goes fast.
Yeah, it does.
So, as we talked about before, we're going to ask you a few questions. And since this podcast is obviously about Susanville, we kind of wanted to start with talking about the history of it, which, sort of the identity, where the town comes from. And so you were an obvious choice as our first guest. And so I guess our first question is, what's your connection to Susanville?
Well, like I said, I've moved here in 1962 when I was a child, very young. My father went to work at the prison, and so we moved here from San Luis Obispo, California. And I moved a lot as a child, and Susanville was just home. When I got here, I liked it. I liked the four seasons. I liked the winters and summers and spring and fall. And so I've always wanted to stay here. After my husband and I were married, we moved away for college, and then we came back.
So you work with the Historical Society, and you have quite a bit to do with the sharing of the history of Susanville.
Yes.
Tell us how you got started doing that.
Well, because of my husband's family, I heard a lot of stories about the area. His great-grandmother, who was born here in 1885, used to tell stories, and I was just really intrigued by that since my family was so transient, and these people that had been in the area for so long were just very interesting. So after my kids were in college and I had more time, I decided to join the Historical Society. And immediately they asked me if I wanted to write the newsletter and be the secretary. And I probably should have said no, but that was 2011, and I've done that ever since. So
And you've loved it?
I love it because every time I go to write a story, I learn something. And I like meeting people. We have people come in from all over the world, and it's very interesting.
Yeah.
I like telling the stories. I think when I first started getting involved with the Historical Society, they were mainly involved with the immigrant trains and the first pioneers that came here. But there's so much more history, so much that happened later on, and I've kind of tried to bring that out.
Yeah. We recently read an article that you wrote about Knoch.
Oh,
you say it like that in German.
I would say like that.
David Knoch.
Yeah.
Yes.
And we found it very interesting because of his roots, obviously.
Would you pronounce that Knoch also?
No, like the CH is. It's like a. So I would say if I read it, I would say Knoch.
And I think that probably is how it was pronounced, and it was changed to Knoch. Now people call it Knoch because of the KN, but it was his name, and he pronounced it Knoch, or close to that. And so it was. I think he was a very interesting person because he came here during a lot of turmoil back in Germany. To come to a place like this, he was Jewish. There were no Jewish people around here. So it had to have been very hard for his family. And they were merchants that built up their business, and he started with nothing. and managed to achieve a lot in the town. And so did his son Isaac and his daughter Rachel also. But it must have been really hard on his wife. That's what I figure. And then when they were feeling ill, they would travel to San Francisco to see a Jewish doctor. And they went to the Jewish hospital down in the San Francisco area. They're buried down in the Jewish cemetery in the San Francisco area. So they still had that connection. But there's no synagogue. There's nothing here, to promote the Jewish religion.
Yeah. We have friends who live in the house he built, and
with the little glass.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the cool thing is the husband, the people who live up there, of our
He's
friends, he's
German.
also German. Yeah, and so
So it was very interesting to read the article and be like, "Hey, we know them."
Yeah.
Wow.
I've always thought that window was perfect for a Christmas tree, but they were Jewish.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's right.
They actually moved there after their kids were grown. That's why there's only 2 bedrooms in that house. They had a son named Isaac and a daughter named Rachel. Rachel married another Jewish man named Jules Alexander, and they were prominent in the area too. Jules Alexander's house is down on the southeast corner of North and Roop, close by.
Is that where Alexander Avenue comes from?
Yes, it's named after Jules Alexander. He had a store. They both became, not so much David Canuck, but his son Isaac was in the banking business here in town. Jules Alexander's store was very well received, and he would loan money to people. And people would in turn give him their money to keep safe. I've heard this, a lot of the Basque sheep herders, they didn't have a place, they didn't have a bank or anything they trusted like that. So they would bring their money to Jules Alexander and ask him to keep it for him. And he would give them the paperwork and everything. What they didn't know was he was using their money to buy merchandise for his store and to get his business to grow. But they got their money back when they wanted it, so everything worked out well. So.
Wow, it's very, it's so interesting to find these things out about Susanville, especially because, Susanville is so small, and so it makes it even richer to know the history behind, that building, like that our friends live in, or this road we drive down every day.
Yeah, I find that fascinating. Last summer when we moved here from Germany, I got a book from the library about the history of Susanville. It was mainly about Susan Roop and Isaac Roop. The origins of Susanville, obviously, or it started as would you call it the trading post, or?
It was.
Yeah, which is right here.
The building out back.
The building. Can you tell us more about how it started and Isaac Roop, maybe?
Isaac Roop was of German descent. He was born in Maryland, and then his family moved to Ohio, so he came here from Ohio. He had 3 children, and his wife died. So he left the children in Ohio, and he came out here, and his brother had already immigrated and was over in the area around Reading. So Isaac went there to work with his brother. And his brother was doing well, so he left on a boat to go back to Ohio and bring his wife and children out to live here. He died on the way, and he had left everything in Isaac's name. But then they had a fire and everything burned. They owned a hotel and businesses in Reading. So Isaac was left with nothing. There's no fire insurance or anything like that. So coming here was a new venture for him. He thought the Noble's Immigrant Trail came right through here, and so he thought of setting up a trading post. These people were coming off the desert. They had nothing, and so that was his business venture. And he claimed this land in 1853. In 1854, he came back into the area and he built his cabin, which was the trading post. And he laid out the streets of his town, and he sold lots to people. If they were bringing a business in that he wanted, he would give them the lot for free because he wanted to build the town. Yeah. So this was Isaac's business venture. He lived. People talk about he and Susan living in the fort. They never did. He lived there for a short while. By 1861, he moved out into a house on Main Street. Susan Roop came here in 1863. She never lived in the fort. They never used it to fight off marauding Indians. So,
it's like legends circulating.
yes,
probably.
A lot of legends.
Yeah.
I mean, I read about what was this called, the Sagebrush War?
Yes.
But that was not with Native Americans. That was...
No, the Sagebrush Wars. Well, basically, nobody knew where we were here.
Yeah.
They had an idea that because of the mountain range that goes to the west, that was the state line, and we were probably at that time in Utah territory. Nevada territory hadn't been created. So nobody really knew where we were. It was the middle of nowhere. So I believe it was 1858 they created the Nautaqua territory. They decided California didn't want them, Utah didn't want them, so they would make their own government. Mm-hmm. And the reason they really had to make a government was because people were claiming land and there were land disputes. And so they needed some kind of governing agency to oversee the land. Then in 1865, I believe, the territory in Nevada was created. No, it was before that. But anyway, 64 maybe. Anyway, Isaac Roop was appointed the first governor of the territory in Nevada, even though he lived here and wasn't in Nevada. Nobody really knew where we were. But so then at that point, we're saying we're in Nevada. Well, Plumas County to the south said, no, you're in Plumas County and we want taxes paid and you're under our jurisdiction. And so they had this little revolt, the Sagebrush War. And the local men got in Isaac Roop's cabin. The people from Plumas County came over and they got in a barn to the west about a block up Nevada Street and they shot back and forth. They tore up the fort floor, which wasn't a fort then, it was a trading post, and built a barricade and stacked dirt for protection. I think 2 people were shot. One of the men from Plymouth was shot in the lake, and one of them from the Honey Lake Valley was shot in the shoulder during the fighting, and it lasted about a day and a half. And they decided that, well, we are friends.
Let's not do that.
People needed people around here. So isolated, you didn't want to alienate anyone.
Yeah.
So they decided to have the state of Nevada and the state of California do a survey and decide where we were, and we were, after the survey, in California. So we created our own county, Lassen County, in 1864.
Yeah.
I think that's so interesting. This the fact that Susanville is pretty isolated. It's
Very
part of California,
isolated.
but you still have that today of like people not wanting to be a part of California because it doesn't really feel like the rest of California. In a way it does, but in a way it doesn't. And so you still have that today, like people wanting to be separated from.
Right. We have DirecTV. We can't get California stations.
Yeah.
So everything is Nevada.
Yeah.
But those mountains were difficult to cross.
Yeah.
And that was a big problem. So it was easier to go towards Nevada.
But I mean, still now, like, say it's winter, like you'd rather go to Reno instead of Redding or something like that, right? Yeah. So.
And it still gets very isolated during the fires a year or so ago. They had fires and all the highways out of town were closed except one to go north. So, if you had to get to Reno, you were out of luck. The road was closed. And so those things happen. And a lot of people don't understand that, the isolation.
Yeah. Backing up to when he first came over the mountain and found this place, I like to imagine like when we come over the mountain now, there's obviously like buildings and stuff that we see, but I just like to imagine how beautiful it must have looked coming from over the mountain. I mean, it's beautiful both ways coming into Susanville, but there's something special when you come in,
and
down
see the
mountain.
expanse of the valley.
Like he must have been in love.
Right. Well, but you have to understand, it will look different. There were no deciduous trees like there are now, no shrubs or flowers or lawns. It was just like it is out on the hills. That's the way it was in town. So there was a lot of work to be done before it looked lush.
Yeah.
But he came here, the Nobles Trail was really created about 1851. And the reason Nobles found this trail was because of the Donner Party problems. Nobody wanted to go that way anymore and get caught. So there were other people who were trying to create a way to get from the east to the west coast. And so this became a really good way to go.
Yeah.
A lot easier than a lot of them.
Yeah.
So Nobles Trail was perfect to start his business.
Yeah. and here's some trivia that I read. You probably know that the Susan River is not named after Susan Rube.
Named after Susan Nobles.
Exactly, after a noble's wife who...
Right, and she never saw it.
I thought it was so interesting, what a coincidence.
Yeah, I mean, everybody thinks it's probably because of Susan Rube.
Yeah.
It was named Susan River before Roop got here.
Mm-hmm.
And when he first settled here, this was called Roop's Rancho or Roop Town. It wasn't called Susanville until about 1858. And that was the first time Susanville was used.
Yeah.
So,
do you know why they decided to change it?
I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Everyone just I think I read in a book I'm reading, it's mostly pictures of Susanville with lots of captions, that Susan was a very wonderful woman who helped people who were needy and sick. So maybe she was just very beloved.
I think she probably was. She was a housewife. She was very involved with her church, which was the Methodist Church, and she helped create the Methodist Church that's here today. She had 8 children. But in that time, if somebody was injured or sick, they took them to a woman. And she was a woman, and there weren't a lot of women, and she had that motherly, sense about her. And that was her career, was her family and her community. She really never moved away from Susanville once she got here. I understand when their son went to college, her youngest son, her and her husband decided to move down to Palo Alto because he went to Stanford. But I don't think they ever really did. I read in the newspaper they were ready to go and some man was going to take care of their property here while they were gone, but I don't think they ever left. So
I personally think there's just something about Susanville that draws people back. I mean, I know plenty of people move away. I was gone for 7.5 years in another country, but there's just something about it. I think it's just a little jewel tucked into the mountains.
I think it has a lot of so many different things, just like the seasons. People talk about where is the area, the affluent area of town. We really don't have that. You can have a nice house, and next door it's not a fancy house or anything. It's just a community made up of people, and they do come together, and I think that's important.
Yeah. That's very beautiful.
Yeah.
So you've already said that your husband's family is from here, came here a long time ago.
From Germany.
From Germany, wow.
It's
There's
awesome.
a lot of Germans here.
Yeah, while reading about the history and stuff like that, I've encountered in so many spots this person was of German descent or this. And for me as a German immigrating into the U.S., I'm not a U.S. citizen. I'm a resident. So I'm a green card holder. Thank God, it's awesome. It's super interesting to hear about that. I'm not trying to compare myself to what these people did or who these people were, but still there's similarities to even our story.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. So. We were told by one of our neighbors that the area we live in was once called Immigrant Hill. It's around Knock Street. Knoch. Yeah.
So that's one nice way of putting it.
To us it sounds nice. I guess it wasn't so nice.
They used a lot of slang, but that area, Canuck and Prospect and those streets up there, those were all homes for mill workers. And so with the fruit growers mill, brought in most of them. There's Lassen Lumber and Box Mill too. But when the mill was built, they built a lot of those houses. And a lot of the workers came from Europe. A lot of Italian. There were some Spanish. I think more Italian than anything, really. But so I won't say what it used to be called.
Okay. Yeah. But yeah, so it's very it's nice to hear about the families, like your husband's family, that have been here.
Right.
The
His
entire
family
time.
was not really very German. They were British. Because of political problems in England, they moved to Germany. And because of political unrest in Germany, they immigrated here quite some time later, several generations. But they came here, and my husband's great-grandfather had a blacksmith shop where the Hotel Mount Lassen is right now.
Okay.
He was in partnership with Jørgen Jensen, and he and Jørgen Jensen both did well, and they bought ranches, and the Jensens are still around. And my husband's family name was Brockman. There are no Brockmans left that are relatives because the name died out when they didn't have enough sons.
I'd be interested in knowing how many of the original families are still here with.
There are quite a few. Isaac Root's descendants are still here.
Oh.
He has a great, let's see, I'm trying to figure how many great grandson who lives here in town, Chuck Miles.
Okay.
He's a retired plumber. Isaac Root's great-granddaughter used to be here in the museum, and she worked as a docent, and she passed away in 2016 or 17. She was in her 90s.
Oh, wow.
She had a lot of stories to tell.
Wow, I bet.
What are some of your favorite stories, like from the history of Susanville?
Well, I have a lot of stories about Susanville. I always like the stories about people and how life is different now than it was. One of my favorite stories is the story about Maud Bintel. Maud Bintel was, she worked out in Amity. And Amity was a town in the north of Eagle Lake. And the reason it was created was because the railroad...
Honey Lake.
Yes, Honey Lake, I'm sorry. The north of Honey Lake, the narrow gauge railroad got there in 1890, and it stopped. And so that was the railroad terminus. So the town built up around it. And there's also hot springs there. So it became kind of a little spa place. Thriving town, had a huge hotel. And if somebody wanted to go on the train, they would have to travel to Amity, spend the night, and go on the train. They also had a ferry that came across Honey Lake, and it stopped there. So people like from Milford could put their cattle and people too on the ferry and go across to get to the train. So Maud Bintel was, she worked at the telegraph office, and she also worked as a waitress. And she and some other ladies were sitting in the hotel one day. And this was about 1894. And these three cowboys came into town and got drunk. And they came into the dining room and abused the women terribly. That's the quote from the newspaper. What they did was use foul language. But in those days, that was abusing the women terribly. So Maud was so upset. She was 17 years old. She went upstairs to her room, and one of the cowboys tried to follow her upstairs. And then he went out into the street and was yelling at her through the window because he knew it was tormenting her and he was just being a bully. Well, Maud was just distraught, so she went behind the bar in the drugstore and she got some strychnine and she drank it. And then she went back and she sat there with the ladies and started foaming at the mouth and told them what happened. And they, of course, tried to save her, but they couldn't. So the town was in an uproar. What are they going to do about this? So two of the cowboys were bright enough to leave right away. Third one hung around, and he's the one that was arrested. But they didn't know what to charge him with, and they kept him in jail for several days. Finally, they ended up charging him, they fined him $200 for disorderly conduct. They also fined the owner of the hotel, Louis Bintel, $200 for keeping a disorderly house. And that was the end of it. And Maud was gone, and she's buried up in the old cemetery.
Okay.
But to me, it just shows how things were so different.
Yeah. Wow.
So it was, some ways it was a gentler world, and some ways it wasn't.
It was rough.
I read here in the museum that Peter Lassen was buried under this giant ponderosa pine because that was his favorite spot. And I loved that so much because when you have a connection to a place, you kind of take ownership of it and you have favorite spots and things like that, and it means something to you. So my question for you is, do you have a favorite spot?
Oh, gosh. Maybe Inspiration Point.
Yes.
Yeah, it has a nice view.
Yeah.
My husband and I used to drive up there and park when we were dating.
Oh. Cute.
But, I just like the whole town, really.
Yeah.
I went on a on a walk with our youngest son in the stroller yesterday, and he was just sitting there, and we walked past Memorial Park, and even we came up over the bridge and past the fort here, and I just so me being from Germany, like Susanville is so different than any small town in Germany, and I really love it. I really do. And so since like earlier we talked about where it's located, and just going back to Isaac Group real quick and how remote it is. I think for one, like being located like on the edge of the desert, so to say, and the mountains is very, very beautiful. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of variety. And the other thing is, I think which obviously was the reason why he started out here, it's strategically smart. The immigrants would come basically through the desert, through Honey Lake Valley, and then they needed to restock and all that.
He was a businessman, mm-hmm. and this, he had built, with his brother, he'd built this business up. He came here in 1850, mm-hmm. so he was only here those few years, and he had helped a lot to build a business over in the Reading area. So he was ready for a new venture. Mm-hmm. And what I find fascinating is when his holdings in the Reading area burned, he had nothing. Mm-hmm. And so today, that would be very difficult mm-hmm. to start. Yeah. In those days, it was the same. He came here and he started with nothing and built it up. Mm-hmm. He died in 1869. I believe he was 47 years old, I think. So he didn't live very long, but he did a lot. Mm-hmm. The town, grew so much, and he gave the land for the cemetery. He tried to give the land to the Methodist Church to build a church, and they wanted to pay. I think they had some kind of finagling going over. They paid $1 or something like that. Oh, yeah. But he really wanted the town to grow, and he promoted it as best he could. So. Mm-hmm.
And now a quick feature from a local business.
Haven Studio Salon is an upscale salon located in the heart of the historic uptown Susanville district. They offer men, women, and children hair services, along with skincare, waxing, and lash extensions. While you are there, take advantage of the many amenities offered: free Wi-Fi, coffee and tea bar, beer, and lots of hospitality. Give them a call at 530-257-5274 or visit them at 614 Main Street in Susanville. They look forward to seeing you soon.
Now back to our episode with Susan.
And now a couple more questions about you personally. What is your favorite time of day?
Morning. I watch the sunrise every morning.
That's beautiful.
That's very beautiful. We like the mornings too, right?
Yeah.
And the day feels fresh.
Mornings are fresh.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And as the day progresses.
People that sleep late miss so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
You think it's gonna feel good, but
yeah, we have
it doesn't.
We have this little thing. So we have 3 kids, a 6-year-old, a 4-year-old, and a 1-year-old. And when everybody's awake in the morning, we do this thing called morning routine, which is basically we go to the front door, open it, and
we'll kind of step out and look out.
And breathe in the morning air and just, yeah.
Yeah,
and
our baby loves it.
Yeah, our 1-year-old, whenever he hears us say morning routine, he's like, runs to the door. Yeah. It's cute. So we like mornings too.
Speaking of breathing in the fresh air, what does Susanville smell like to you?
Well, it depends on where you are.
Yeah.
It does usually fresh air. It's the sagebrush smell. Mm-hmm. It's something I remember. I remember getting off the plane when we went to Boston, and when we landed, and this was in Reno, but it has that, kind of thing. We smelled sagebrush. There had just been a thunderstorm in it, so it's damp sagebrush. Mm-hmm. Love that smell.
Yeah. Me too. Yeah. You get used to it when you're here, and then you go away and you come back and you're like, oh.
Right, you forget it when you're here. Yeah. But then,
And what we also like is the pine tree smell.
Vanilla.
What is it? Vanilla smell.
Oh, Ponderosa pines.
Ponderosa pines. Yeah. When the first time
they also smell like pineapple.
Oh.
Okay.
So next time you smell one and you're
think
thinking
about that.
vanilla,
You need to
think
think
pineapple, and it'll be the same thing.
Right. Yeah, the first time I visited Susanville was in 2015 when we got married at the old courthouse. And I was fascinated by those trees and how good they smell. It's awesome. It's really, because there are pine trees in Germany, but they just smell like
Different
trees.
kinds.
Yeah, they're different pines. So, yeah. So now the question about Susanville, where we're at right now, where we're going maybe. So without considering the plausibility of it, what would you change about Susanville?
I wouldn't change anything. I really like change, and I like people coming in with new ideas and starting new things. But I'm more of a go with the flow person. I like it the way it is. I'm sure there can be improvements made, but I wouldn't change anything.
Mm-hmm.
Good. Then I don't need to ask you the next question. I was going to ask how you can bring about that change, but...
Yeah.
Well, I'm not a change person. I'm a adaptable person. So.
I think isn't that like part of being a historian is like more documenting the change. Yeah, and that's very important. I mean, looking around here in the museum, it's just amazing how all of this stuff was preserved, the pictures, all the items and all that stuff, and you need that.
Maybe it's because I have read the history of the area a lot and done a little research into it. And it's the same anywhere. Mm-hmm. The change happens all the time.
Yeah.
So the biggest change this area has had was when the immigrants got here and the native people were displaced and they had to adapt. Mm-hmm. And that began change that just continued. I mean, the automobile, electricity, and there were people that were against both of those. It's learning to adapt and embrace the change is what you have to do. It may not be good, but you'll find out later, and maybe you won't do that. But the change is important, I think, to let us know what we really want and how we want to do things. Mm-hmm. So,
and I think from what you said, electricity, automobiles, like people being very skeptical, maybe even scared of that in the past. Right now, we're also facing change, obviously, as in the whole world, but also as individuals. And I think learning or looking back, you can learn from it that, as you said, the change will happen, and we'll see if it's good or bad. But we don't need to be necessarily condemning all the new things that are happening.
Right.
Yeah.
I like new things. I like technology. I like the solar energy and geothermal energy. I'd like to be able to, have all of that. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important that we keep finding new things.
Yeah.
Yeah. It seems charming to take a ferry across Honey Lake, but it's a lot easier to drive around it nowadays.
I can't even imagine, because Honey Lake is not really a lake anymore.
Well, the farming and ranching has depleted a lot of the water, and climate change too.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you so much for your time and
you're
all
welcome.
of your insight and wisdom that you've shared with us.
That was fun. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, it was very, very interesting. And as we record more episodes, I think with other people who have different stories, and I think this was very important, as I said in the beginning, to kind of set the stage, so to say, let people know, even maybe people who are not Susanville locals, to give people sort of a portrait of where the town is coming from.
Right.
So thank you so much.
You're
really
welcome.
Appreciate that. Yeah.
I hope people who haven't come to see the museum since they were in school or ever, I hope they come once they hear this.
I do
too.
too. A lot of people are kind of afraid. They haven't been here. They don't, it's a little building, what's in there, and and then they're usually surprised when they get there.
It's a treasure. It really is.
Really is.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of stories like the suffrage movement, the effects of prohibition on the area. So many things. During the Depression, there were a lot of people in this area that weren't affected at all. They were already bartering and they were poor, and they didn't really know much about it. Didn't really happen to them. It was far different than the city, where you were dependent on so much. You know.
Fascinating. I think we could talk for hours about the history because so many,
we could.
so many interesting things.
Yeah. My husband's great uncle was a cowboy out on the Madeline Plains. He owned horses and raised horses, and he was drafted in World War II, so 1941, I think it was. He went off to war, and he saw these things that he'd never imagined seeing. He was on a boat across the ocean and went to Australia first. And because he'd been a cowboy, they put him in charge of the mules that they were using during the war, and he hated mules. But the things he saw, it was taken out of this little area, and I think it was 1957 when they first got electricity out in the Madeline Plains. So, things were different for people out there. Yeah. And it's still different out there.
Yeah. I know we were about to wrap up, but I have one more question about the history of Susanville. Because you talked about Native Americans earlier. So from what I know, the relationship or the encounters of white settlers and Native Americans were mostly friendly. Is that right? No.
In this area?
Yeah, in this area.
From the very beginning, there was conflict.
Oh, okay.
The problem, I think a lot of the problem was the immigrants coming across the plains had met other Indian tribes. There were a lot of very robust Native people. They had horses. The image we see in the old Western movies of this Native person on a horse and the brave. And these were strong, wealthy tribes. When they got here, the tribes were not as wealthy. They were wealthy in their own way, but there is not a lot of natural wealth in this area. So they were treated more like livestock or even wild animals by the immigrants, and it caused a lot of problems. But they started rebelling, and so here are these people bringing in cattle. They were starving, so they would kill a cow, and their whole culture was different. I think the Potato War is a good example of this. The Potato War was with the Washoe people. The Washoe people shared everything. They would come up into Lassen County from the southern end, and they would hunt for food. They took it back, and they all shared. It wasn't mine. That didn't occur to them. It was stuff. There was a man out in the Milford area who had like 3 acres of potatoes, and he was gone, came into Susanville, and the Washoe people came along, and they were, well, here's potatoes. And it caused a war. And when this man came home and found his potatoes gone, he got a bunch of the neighbors together, and they went off after these Washoe people. The Washoe were in camp, just minding their, and they went and killed a lot of them. Got some of their potatoes and brought them back. But meanwhile, more reinforcements came from the tribe, and they started this little war. These conflicts went on constantly, and it was a clash of culture, different ways of thinking. And so the people that are left here today, the Native people, they have adapted, and
because as we said earlier, change always happens, no matter if it's good or bad. You
have to learn to go with it, but these cultures had been thousands of years, and they had never even thought of change.
Well, let's wrap up. Susan has some guests here in the museum.
That's right.
Yes.
So thanks again.
Thank you.